Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special Institute of Race Relations live stream. I'm your host for this evening, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
Good evening, Nick. Well as can be expected.
Very good. And Mr. Gabriel Krauser. Gabriel, how are you?
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Excellent. So tonight we're going to, of course, be discussing one of the great policy questions of our current age, and that is expropriation without compensation, or EWC, as we usually call it. We will take some questions during the presentation that audience members may have about EWC. So comment on whatever platform you're watching, and we'll pick a couple of those to read out. But I thought we'd start out with a comment that was left on our Facebook page in response to something we had written about expropriation without compensation and some of the dangers of it. And this person said, "Why is the IRR sowing fear and discord amongst citizens?" And then went on to explain that there are 5 limited circumstances in which EWC would be used by the government, that it's something that's done all over the world by any developed country, and went on to say basically that one of the cases where it's necessary is that certain municipalities are owed large amounts of money by property owners, but those people don't pay, and that expropriating the property without compensation is a fair way to deal with people who owe significant municipal debt. So, Terence, let me start with you. Why is to quote this person, the IRR sowing fear and discord amongst the citizens?
We are not sowing fear and discord. We are merely alerting the country to what is perhaps the most elemental and existential danger to South Africa's future as a prosperous constitutional democracy. Nothing quite like this has happened since the country's democratic transition in the 1990s. This is the first time that the Bill of Rights is being tampered with. It is being tampered with to achieve a goal that its proponents can't really define. We're told, well, the Constitution as it stands already permits certain expropriations without compensation. But let's go along and change the most the sort of bedrock section of the Constitution that deals with the relationship between the citizen and the state. We see that being expressed both through the constitutional amendment, but also through the expropriation bill, and a number of other subsidiary developments over the years. We've seen the Valuer General's regulations, for instance. All of these, what they are doing is not so much just specifying or making explicit provision for expropriation without compensation, but they stand to fundamentally alter the nature of property rights, the protections that people enjoy under the Constitution, under the law, for their assets, and to expand the discretion of the state to make those interventions. Fear and discord. Well, I think that this is something that at the very, very least needs to be properly understood. It needs to be understood for what it is, not for what certain people assure us it is.
Right, and exactly on that point, a lot of this is framed, Gabriel, as a land reform bill, or something that will just be used in very specific circumstances, as this commenter claimed. But Terence says it's an attack on property rights. What's going on here?
Yeah, so I think that there are 2 complicated truths that one has to hold in one's head from the start. And they are the fact that land reform in South Africa has been stalled seriously to the dissatisfaction of those who are still in the queue. And that creates a real political incentive for reform. Together with that, you have the fact that the Expropriation Act under which South Africa currently operates is not constitutionally consistent with the 1996 new dispensation. So that's the one fact. There really is a need for new legislation, both from a legal point of view and from the point of view of people who are being left chewing dust. The other fact that you have to hold in your mind is that most South Africans do not prioritize land reform. We have seen this consistently in the statistical surveys that we have done. And we know that in the ANC's own polling, land reform has not appeared in the top 12 items of the agenda. So the kinds of changes that need to be made are specific, they're technical, a lot of them are administrative, as highlighted in the Kgalema Motlanthe report, where the Constitution was seen not to be the major obstacle. The same was held by the Constitutional Court in the Mwelasi versus Hilton case, which instituted a special master to oversee the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform's dealings with labor tenants because they had been found to be so inept, incapable, and unconstitutionally serving. So there are these technical and specific administrative changes that need to be made, but that is not the kind of proposal that we're seeing on our hands. What we are seeing on our hands is, as Terence has said, an elemental shift, one not consistent with the needs, either as perceived by the people or as is the case, as seen by the real experts who've looked into this. And to explain that, you have to look at the broader political program of action, which the ANC has recommitted itself to at every major convention for at least the last 15 years. And that is one which explicitly calls for nationalization, taking power in the commanding heights of the economy, putting the national democratic revolution, their words, not mine, front and center of the agenda. And that means the fundamental erosion of your rights, Terence's rights, my rights, and the rights of every South African who does or aspires to have private property. So it's this broader political program that I think some critics fail to attend to in understanding why this matters so much. If there was a different kind of government in charge, I think there'd be a different kind of conversation. But of course, if there was a different kind of government in charge, no one would be trying to amend the Constitution to deal with land reform. And of course, I've been speaking in broad strokes to finish off on a narrow and specific reading of the proposed legislation. We see in the Expropriation Bill, currently before Parliament, we see that the list is not constrained. It's specifically left open. We see that it does make reference to land, but that the kinds of provisions that it makes account for could be applied to any asset, starting with the first one, which is that property may be expropriated without compensation just in case that property is being held for speculative purposes, which is to say you've bought it for 10 and you intend to sell it for 12 without doing anything to it yourself. Now, if you say that that asset is open to expropriation without compensation, then every asset on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is not held by a major investor who is actively participating in shareholder meetings, is likewise up for expropriation without compensation. Now, I've just started with, let's say, 6 trillion rands worth of assets up for the books. We also see, of course, the prescribed assets issue, which has come and gone and is coming back again in terms of the 4 trillion rand pension pot. And if you look at the ad hoc committee to advise the president on land reform, its provisions on what kinds of scenarios it envisages expropriation without compensation taking place in, again, use a logic which applies far beyond land, but in fact applies to all assets which are not already in the possession of the state. And by assets in the possession of the state, I mean, of course, such stellar enterprises as the South African Airways.
Right. So one of the things, so let me talk specifically about what we are trying to do here tonight. We're not just here to talk necessarily about expropriation only. We had a very, we are here to talk about expropriation, but not just sort of generally. We had a very specific question. And for this evening, we invited the Minister of Public Works, Minister de Lille. And we also invited, I believe, and Gabriel, correct me if I'm wrong here, because I believe you wrote the letters to these organizations, but the Banking Association of South Africa as well, to join us and explain to us why our concerns weren't founded. And the idea here was that considering how high the stakes are, considering the massive powers that this bill could potentially create. We wanted specifics from the Banking Association of South Africa and the government on precisely how the bill will work. So let me get into that more specifically by saying, Terence, as we understand it now, based on how the discussions and the submissions to Parliament have been going on this, if you have a piece of property, whatever that may be, that is expropriated by the state, but you owe a bond or something on that property. So let's say it's a house. Who pays for it? Who pays for the bond?
All right. I think it's important here to just begin by setting out a small nuance. Expropriation without compensation, nil compensation, EWC, whatever monarchy you want to give for it, has become, let's say, the totem around which this debate has been framed. But what is important to note is that the bill, as it stands now, seems primed to discount a property even where compensation is paid. So this is not necessarily a case of a particular instance where the government takes something and doesn't offer compensation. It's also what happens when it offers compensation, but that is far below the value or the in this case perhaps the outstanding amount on a bond. So let's say, for instance, you have incurred a debt of 2 million rand to buy a property. For the first couple of years, you're likely to be paying off interest. So when, let's say, we're about 7 years in, we've managed to pay about 500,000. Along comes the state and they decide, well, they want this, and there's various discount factors that they've written in, which are not just limited to those five. If you look at the Valuer General's regulations, if it's a land reform case, essentially there's a 50% discount that sort of begins the valuation. So let's say, they say, okay, we'll offer you 500,000 for this. All right, well, that leaves you with a difference of a million rand. I don't have a million rand lying around. I mean, I know there's some strange things under Gabriel's pillow, but
Terrence.
I don't think but I doubt there's a million rand there either.
No.
The point is, according to the bill, the bond will be terminated. That's our reading, but the debt doesn't vanish. The debt is actual money, and someone has advanced it. Someone has incurred that debt. This is the question that fundamentally we want the government to answer, and we wanted the Banking Association. In the event that happens, who is going to carry the can? Now, if we look at some of the things that have come out of various financial institutions and from officials at the Banking Association, their idea seems to be that they wish to protect themselves as institutions. So they've said things like the payment must be guaranteed. Now, does that mean that they expect the government to make up the shortfall, which would rather seem to me to negate the whole purpose of expropriating without compensation or granting yourself a large discount, since you're just redirecting where the payment would go? If we look at their submission, they talk about how the loan would remain, but it would be on an unsecured basis. But that certainly suggests to me that they would still expect to be collecting. Now, as I say, we have a situation where people in South Africa have a very strong attachment to property ownership. Buying a house is the biggest investment a household will make. It is not only their shelter and living quarters, but it's also an investment for old age. If that asset is taken, and if they are still saddled with the debts required that they'd incurred in the hopes of purchasing it, well, that's ruin. You simply won't. You simply will never recover from that. And this is a question that the banks, corporate South Africa, need to answer. Is this what they would envisage for their clients, for whom they for whom they hold in stewardship wealth and assets? to the government, if is the ideological impulse such that they are willing to ruin and bankrupt people? Is there some other scheme? Because frankly, this to me seems to be for corporate South Africa, dereliction of its corporate governance responsibilities. South Africa has been very proud of the way that it's spread ideas of a corporate accountability across global corporate governance thinking. And is this something that the government and the ruling party are happy with? Is this the manner in which they believe that it is justifiable to treat its citizens, either collectively or in individual cases?
Right, and that's, I think, why it's very concerning tonight that neither the minister nor the Banking Association of South Africa wanted to come on this show and address these concerns directly, and perhaps suggest that there might be a silver lining, because I think it suggests that instead we're dealing with the worst case scenario. Gabriel, I believe the minister responded to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that response involved, or should we move on from here?
No. I think we must talk about that. So, yeah, we wrote to Minister Patricia de Lille. She tabled the expropriation bill before Parliament. So it is our working assumption that she is competent in understanding the bill, that she is the reigning expert, basically, and that her department has some powers regarding the administration, and so that she's the right person to ask how we can expect this to be implemented. And as Terence has just said, we laid out in very clear and sort of legally robust language what our question was. To put it in layman's terms, the question is, in the event that a property is expropriated, which is at the same time collateral on a loan without compensation, or with compensation significantly below market value, will A, the bank write off the bad debt, B, the loan holder be expected to continue to repay that debt, or C, some option that we have not yet considered? The minister replied by quoting at length the Constitution and saying, for example, the point on which we very much agree, which is that the current Expropriation Act, legislated in the 70s, is not constitutional, and thus requires amendment to come into line with the current constitutional dispensation. On that point, we've agreed. Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, our esteemed colleague, has written about that quite eloquently, and has in fact drafted a version of the expropriation bill that would be consistent with our current constitution, and which would, as we believe our current constitution demands, defend property rights so as to defend the citizen, the puny citizen, as she puts it, and I think quite rightly, when compared to the powerful state, to the potent state, and often venal state actors. So we agree that we need an amendment to the Constitution. We agree that we need an amendment to the legislation to come in line with the Constitution. This is what the minister focused on. The minister also focused on the Constitution's prerogatives to serve the agenda of land reform, which is, again, just the same point in different language. And then the minister said, basically, that there is nothing else to say. So that didn't answer our question.
Right. That's not exactly satisfactory.
and the reason implicitly the reason that the minister seemed to give for not disclosing any further information is that she would not want to undermine the parliamentary process. The bill is sitting before the National Assembly, and it is the National Assembly's duty to pass the bill or amend the bill or block the bill. At a later stage, it'll be the president's duty to veto the bill or give assent to the bill, and the National Council of Provinces will probably be involved in that too. She doesn't want to undermine that process. So we then replied to Minister de Lille and said, of course, the Institute of Race Relations is not in the habit of asking a minister of the government to undermine Parliament in writing. We might make mistakes, but that is not the kind of mistake we're inclined to make. In fact, we're not asking Minister de Lille to say whether the bill should be passed or not, whether the bill should be amended or not, and if it should be amended, how it should be amended. And of course, it would be ridiculous for the minister to table a bill and then say to an independent NGO that she really would like the bill to be amended and that some other version should be passed. If she thought that some other version should have been passed, that is the version that she would have put forward in the first place. And we do not expect the minister to be so incompetent as to put forward the version that she doesn't think is the best version either. We don't mean to impute any kind of incapacity on her side in that front. And we clarify this in a letter in a response to the minister, saying, of course, we don't want to undermine the process, and of course, we don't suppose that you put any version forward other than the version that you thought should be put forward. Our question is on understanding how it should be implemented. We are, after all, simple people. Simple in the sense that we are preoccupied with the concrete facts of the matter. The philosophy and the ideology is something that we attend to, but we really are concerned about how ordinary South Africans are going to have to face this on a very concrete basis. And we aren't exactly sure what to make of this, and so we would like your clarity. We got no response on that front. Likewise, in our communications with the Banking Association of South Africa, BASA, we laid out our questions, and the response that we got is, please look at our submission. We really don't have anything else to say. Now, here's what I take from this. The Institute of Race Relations has a long and illustrious history, and you can take a fine-tooth comb and peruse this history in search of a major fault or even of some minor faults, and it will take you a long time before you come across any kind of grievous error. That said, we are but human beings. We are fallen angels. We are none of us perfect, and we are capable of making mistakes. And perhaps it is the case that we have made a mistake. Perhaps it is the case, after all, that we lack the imagination of our political leadership and of corporate leadership, and that they can see a way to do this thing, and that we can't see that thing. If this could work, it is my humble opinion that either the minister or one of her representatives or BASA or one of their representatives would have come forward today and explained to you and me and the public how it will work. The fact that no one came forward is a suggestion, quite a serious suggestion, that it can't work, and that it is not a lack of imagination on our part not to see how it can possibly work. It is just the fact that 2 + 2 do not equal 5, and that no one can tell you how to make that work. And let me focus in on a point, because we have written about this and we have seen other comments coming forward. And some people think that if the banks just take the hit, a lot of people have the following view. Look, if I owe money in exactly the kind of situation that Terence put forward, I bought a house for 2 million rand. I've been paying it off for the last 7 years. So I've paid a lot of interest, but I've eaten 500,000 into the principal. So now in principle, I owe 1.5 million rand, and then that property gets expropriated without compensation. Well, the bank can kiss the money goodbye because it's not getting it from me. Finish and klar, so to speak. Okay? And people think that in that case, they've lost their property and the bank's taking a hit, and that it's sort of limited to that. The problem is the following. In the event that banks face the serious prospect of having a significant number of their loans go bad, that punishes all of their other clients, and in turn punishes the rest of the country. If you look at the state of banking in South Africa, it is fundamentally weaker. This country was built on mining since its union. That was the major industry. But in the sort of last generation or two, banking, financial services have by far taken over as the leading contributors to GDP. And we had extremely strong, very conservative banking system with extremely strong governors at the South African Reserve Bank, protecting the sovereignty of our currency as well as our financial instruments. That has taken a serious knock. If you look since expropriation without compensation was tabled as an issue by the president before Parliament, banks have lost approximately 20%, maybe as much as a quarter of their value on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Banks have been double down. Their junk status is like, it's junk of junk. They've been downgraded to junk status and then downgraded a further level into junk status again. And that is because the SARBs, the government's bonds, have also been downgraded, and the banks are sitting holding a lot of government debt, which might not be repaid, which would be a form of expropriation without compensation. It's also because of the fact that our GDP in real terms has stagnated, that gross fixed capital formation has shrunk, that real asset value of South Africa declined in 2019, and in real terms declined in 2018 too. So shrinking country has come along with more over-indebtedness. Then you get into coronavirus, and it's like putting steroids into the germs. And we now see a report covering over R1 trillion worth of collateralized assets, showing that the percent of those loans that are in arrears beyond 3 months has gone up by about 50%. So now we're sitting at about the 6% mark. And if you remember in the US, when they had their bond crisis, it was in about 7% arrears. So our banks are sitting in a very, very weak position. If they have to downgrade the value of their own books, if they have to say, in other words, look, I as Bank X am holding, I've extended bonds worth R500 billion or 250 billion rand, and they're collateralized by these assets. And now I have to decrease the valuation I have by 5% or increase the risk factor that some of these are going to be expropriated at less than market value and that I'm going to have to write off that bad debt. Then South Africa is tipped over the edge in terms of its basic financial institutions. So the banks have to do that if they are not going to somehow take the money, even though the property is being expropriated.
Right.
So either the banks have to screw over their clients by saying, look, you've lost your asset, but you still have to pay us back. And I don't think anyone can really stand for that and be sort of politically intolerable. I think any bank that does that is just going to see a lot of customers leave and moving their assets elsewhere. Or the banks are going to have to say, no, what, we'll write off our debts, but we're also going to push up our interest premiums by 2%. We're going to push up our risk factor and our discount in our own books by 5%. And that's going to send us into a debt crisis tailspin, which is again going to punish all of the customers. So when I say I don't think it can work, when I say 2 + 2 can't equal 5, it's because I don't see either strategy by the banks, either a strategy pursuant to still collecting the debt or a strategy pursuant to just writing it off and saying, okay, this is part of our social justice kind of contribution to the country, as working. Neither way works. And I believe that's why BASA couldn't come forward to tell us how it will work.
Right. So this raises a very important question. And Terence, feel free to add to anything that Gabriel's said there. Also, I'd just like to remind our audience that you guys can ask questions, and we will see if we can answer some of them, especially towards the end. So Terence, Gabriel's just laid out a case for why this is going to be disastrous for the banks. And yet the opposition from the banks is not particularly strong. I mean, we were talking earlier before the show about the way that the banks have responded to this. But I think we both agree that the banks have not exactly come out fighting on this issue. Why would South Africa's banking system go along with this? Some people in the comments here suggested it's because the banks are filled with ANC cadres. What's your thoughts?
Look, I think that the reason is probably somewhat more prosaic. It's, I think, not dissimilar from why the private healthcare health insurers have not been more vocal about the national health insurance. You're talking about a very, very heavily regulated industry. You're talking about an industry that functions to a large extent at the mercy of the state. If it doesn't get the licenses, if it doesn't get the approvals, it becomes very, very difficult for it to do business. And so I think that probably accounts for most of it. And perhaps they've done a cost benefit calculation and they believe that they can that they may have to, or they will need to accept a certain level of damage in order to save the bigger picture. So if the choice is between standing firmly for the interests of those who have entrusted their life savings to them and displeasing those who hold the regulatory power of life and death, I suppose it goes to the latter. Now, I think that business is an inherently conservative thing, small c conservative. It doesn't like to rock the boat. It's about carrying on its business, before it's about anything else. But this I think is one of those situations in which that sort of approach is not viable. I mentioned corporate governance thinking. The King reports talk about how it is immoral or unethical to expect future generations to pay for the excesses of the current. Similarly, is it in any way ethical to sacrifice the interests of people who are guilty of no wrongdoing to appease the ideological appetites of the state? What could they have done? Well, I think they could have spoken out more forcefully. They could have been less complacent. I think the idea that we'll sort of wait for certainty is a very inadequate default. I think once you have that certainty, it's probably rather too late to intervene. And I think that there have been instances, such as when the representative of the Agricultural Business Chamber endorsed the report of the Presidential Panel on Land Reform. Banks did not speak up, although they are members of this body. Something like that, I think, could have had a noticeable impact. But yes, I think that what you find, I think, on many issues with corporate South Africa is this approach that if you feed the crocodile, you might avoid being eaten. But I think that ignores the lessons of the last decade. We saw just how pathological things could become. We see that an argument that this can't happen because it's economically nonsensical or it's mad. Well, no, it can. We've seen across the border in Zimbabwe. Similar things were also said about the Zimbabwean government. It's often forgotten that there were people who thought that Hugo Chavez in Venezuela was a buffoon and incompetent and everything, but just didn't really know what he was doing. It turns out that there was a particular method in that madness. Now, as destructive as it became, they didn't blunder into it. They walked into it, with purpose. Be very, very careful. I tell people not to underestimate the iron-willed pull of ideology.
If I can jump in and add a point on that, I totally agree, and I think that I think there's just a good old-fashioned game theory point to be made here. So, and the metaphor is putting your head above the parapet. To use the old metaphor, I think what Terence is saying is that businesses are reluctant to put their head above the parapet. If one bank pops its head up and says, we are actually going to be sending our communications liaison onto ENCA, SABC, Newsroom Africa, and whenever they're ready to take us on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, our communications team is going to be out there arguing that this is going to be the death of South Africa's economic prosperity and hopes. We're not just going to make a quiet little submission to Parliament and say something quite positive about EWC to the President's ad hoc committee. We are going to make our position unambiguously and clear on a daily basis. In fact, we are going to sponsor a radio station, or we're going to get an hour-long slot every week on the business hour of this or that, and it's just going to be us every week, week in, week out, saying what a terrible this idea is going to be. Of course, the Institute of Race Relations would be able to help any such communications team because there is not a week since the bill was tabled or since this idea was floated that the Institute has not made some contribution to the public square, especially through my esteemed colleague Terence Corrigan, that to clearly try and persuade people about why, through facts, why this is a bad idea. The banks could have, any one bank could join in. But then that bank, of course, would suffer the kind of slings and arrow that the Institute of Race Relations suffers in terms of public criticism and people trolling us online. That bank, as Terence says, would also suffer something far more serious, which is a potential punitive regulatory move. Why do I say game theory? Because if one chap puts his head above the parapet, he can be sniped at from everyone on the other side. But if everyone puts their head up at the same time, they can then charge over and overwhelm the proponents of expropriation without compensation with reasonable argument. And that is where BASA is supposed to play its role. The idea of having such a thing as the Banking Association of South Africa is to mitigate the risks of bad legislation being pushed and no individual bank having the courage to stand up and say what needs to be said because they might individually be targeted. Instead, there is this institution where the banks can all speak together and come up with a unified message in a way that also allays the fears of people like me. I get terrified when I think about a whole bunch of different bankers getting together in a room because I worry that they might start price fixing. Okay? The point of having BASA is that you have an organized and principled way for banks to get together and discuss this kind of regulation without having any chance of doing the nefarious nonsense that they might like to do in order to gouge you and I for more money. That is BASA's purpose. And in this regard, BASA has served its mandate by submitting to Parliament that this is a terrible idea. It's then somewhat undermined this by submitting to Parliament that, you know, if you are going to go ahead with it, can we remember the Zuma era cabinet resolution that if you do expropriation below market value compensation, then at least you guarantee the banks while screwing down the little guys. That's not a great look. Also not a great look, as we've both alluded to, having a representative on the President's ad hoc committee supporting expropriation without compensation. But more than anything, I mean, the most obvious failure is to show up on this show, and this is just the sort of cherry on the top of a large cake of a deafening absence, to mix my metaphors, over the last 2 years. Where is the BASA radio show? Where is the BASA representative showing up on Newsroom Africa and ENCA and SABC every week? Where is the weekly submissions to the Sunday Times and the Sunday Independent and so on, and the Daily Maverick to say, guys, we are desperate here. South Africa's banking system hasn't been this weak since, I think it's weaker now than it was during the collapse of apartheid. On my reading of the numbers, it hasn't been this weak since World War II. And at that stage, wars actually, really the weakness in war is that your side might lose, as it were, with guns and bombs and tanks and the like. So, I mean, this is an extraordinary situation. And on back channels, senior bankers that we have spoken to are alive to the seriousness of the situation. They are not stupid people, but they are nervous. And I think that a great amount of this failure is to be attributed to the communication side of the banks, because as I've said at the opening, the two facts that you have to hold in your mind is that there is this technical and administrative change that needs to be made to land reform. At the same time, this is not the foremost priority of most South Africans, because most South Africans know that this kind of change needs to be made in a way that supports economic growth, that supports the expansion of jobs, financial security, and the like. And that means that the political ground has been laid for banks to go out there with one voice and oppose this vociferously and consistently. and not to alienate their customers or their investors, but in fact to encourage them. This would not be a Sisyphus rolling a rock up the hill. This would be a very easy kind of PR win. Look, we are out here to protect you. I listen to the radio. What are the ads that I hear coming from the banks? Please, if someone calls you and asks you for your bank code and your ID number, don't give it to them. We will never call you to do that. We want to protect you. And then they leave it at that, and they just say the bank's name, and you think, oh, good golly, that bank wants to protect me, and that makes me feel better. Now, that is a good thing to do. And it would be a very good thing to do to put out ads on a regular basis saying, we don't want the expropriation bill. We are pushing to make sure that it doesn't happen, and that if it does happen, our customers aren't taken advantage of by losing their property and then still being forced to pay it back. And that's because we value you as our customers, and we respect you. And I think many people would hear that and they'd say, well, that's very nice. I'm going to stick with my bank. And I might even write it a letter to say, thank you very much for your efforts. Instead of being afraid, however, of their customers, the banks, as Terence put it, are afraid of the punitive regulatory powers of officials sitting behind their shoulder.
Right. No, exactly. Terence, I'll give you an opportunity to add anything to that. I remembered something that someone suggested to me as a possible reason, a financial reason why banks might be a little bit keen on this, and that is that they might produce some kind of financial product that will help them weather the storm. Like, for example, I don't know, expropriation insurance. So that if your land gets expropriated, then you don't owe the money on the bond or something like that. But in the meantime, you're paying, and they're making some sort of calculation that there won't be that many properties expropriated, and therefore they'll be fine. I know none of us are banking executives or accountants, but do you think that that's a completely crazy suggestion?
Look, I think that if there are seizures at no or at significant reduced compensation, the risk profile of any kind of land investment will escalate, and your bonds will become more expensive. Fewer people will be able to afford them. There'll be another round of recriminations. Well, the banks don't want to lend to poor people, etc., etc., etc. And maybe there's there are people within the government or the ruling party who would find that a very useful thing to be able to do. As we head perhaps towards a state bank or something like that. Those products will, I think, if you're having to take out insurance against the government taking your stuff, you've probably reached a point of such farce in the way the economy works that this thing would probably go the way of the rape survivors policy that some financial institution tried to bring out in the 1990s, because so many people were being raped and they had this insurance thing you could do. They were roundly pilloried for it. There was a certain insensitivity, to be sure. And I think it's more or less the same thing. So, well, but I would like to pick up on the idea that they've made a calculation. Well, there's not going to be too many, and that's probably quite true. But that all, I think, is based on the idea that they think that there is there is a strong element of economic rationality in behind introducing this policy, and one that regards the role of private business and the private financial system as indispensable. I think that is a very iffy suggestion.
Right. Exactly.
Look, I think that you are unlikely to find a senior South African diplomat telling the United Kingdom that in the event that they go to war over the Falklands, we'll be sending troops to help them. However, our ambassador to Venezuela made a pledge that we'd be in the trenches outside Caracas when the U.S. Marine Corps arrived. We are.
SAA would fly the soldiers, of course, to Caracas.
Well, let's not talk about SAA, because if you want the money for land reform, I can tell you where you can go and find most of it. But be that as it may, the fixation on Cuba. There is a very, very strong ideological line that exists within the ANC that has never quite accepted that the 1960s finished, and that East Germany no longer exists, and there's a reason it doesn't exist. And a country like Venezuela, and remember, this was during the relatively pragmatic or economically pragmatic Mbeki era, was trumpeted as providing like a veritable new way to be human, and that wasn't just within the ANC. There was a large body of sort of respectable progressive opinion. The idea that the COVID crisis presented some sort of opportunity. All of these sort of data points, connect the dots. This is it is not a given that severe damage to let's say the wealth holding or wealth generating sections of the economy would not in some quarters be welcomed, or at least be seen as a useful tool to be harnessed. The property clause itself was not entirely accepted by many in the ANC. There's comments being made in Parliament 2004, 2005 about how how Section 25 was a sunset clause. And this was after people like Professor Carter Asmal had made very, I think, very careful and very worthwhile arguments about how it struck the balance South Africa needed. And I think he was broadly right, but many of his colleagues, I think, did not accept this. And I think on top of that, we do have a political class that has known very little other than politics in its life. These are, in large measure, not people who have come from careers in, the professions or in business or even in even as sort of salaried employees, and therefore bring that sort of perspective. Politics is the life that much of our political class has always known, and as the adage goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Right. So there's another thing I want to bring up, and either this question is to either of you, whoever wants to answer it. Terence, you and I recently did a show about this, actually, which you can find on the Daily Friend YouTube channel. But I think, I was talking about a financial product or something that bank could think of to, make money off of expropriation. But that sort of assumes that expropriation is a fairly rare thing that doesn't really happen that often. That's a time-consuming process that government only does occasionally. But you and Anthea Jeffrey, Terence, have pointed out that custodial taking is a possibility with the amendment to the property clause, to the expropriation clause in the Constitution. Very briefly, because I think we've only got about 10 minutes left here, can you tell us what exactly a custodial taking is?
All right. Custodial takings would refer to something like the situation that obtains in South Africa at the moment with regard to mineral rights or water. In a sense, property ownership of that asset is no longer possible. What happened? It is a species of nationalization, but one in which the government actually disclaims the idea that it owns it. It says rather it holds it in trust or in custodianship for the country as a whole. People then are given access through licensing systems, and the idea is that the benevolent hand and wing of the state will ensure that everybody is accorded what they need and what will benefit all to the maximum. Now, this was given a significant push, and I think it was 2013 by the by a judgment in the Constitutional Court where Agri-SA went to court about unused mineral rights, which had been taken by the Mineral and Petroleum Development Act. What the court came down with, and they did say that this was limited to the facts of the case, but bear with me here, was that custodianship does not involve the government taking ownership, and therefore, if the government is not taking ownership, expropriation is essentially a two-step process. One party loses, but the other one must assume, and this only one of those parts happens, you lose. But if that assumption isn't made, then expropriation has not happened, and no compensation is therefore payable. The sort of ownership right vanishes rather than is transferred. We believe that this is quite probably the end game with land. It has appeared in government documents. The 2017 land audit very explicitly made this recommendation, and they also said there should be a land tax on top of that. So you get to you don't get to own it, but you get to pay tax on it, which is an interesting idea. That would render the whole bond issue very, very complicated. I mean, if you can't own the land, are you still paying for the structure? Can you actually own the structure? These are big questions. In 2014, there was a bill on agricultural land which wanted to essentially take all agricultural land in custodianship. And why this is particularly relevant is that if you look at the definition of expropriation, the current expropriation bill, it speaks specifically about the idea of taking ownership. So it seems that what they have done is they've taken the reasoning from that case, and they've tried to turn it into a definition which will make that a point of general principle. And once that is in place, with the constitutional amendment and the expropriation bill, that will be a backstop which will make challenging this very, very difficult.
Right. So, Terence, there's a question from the audience here. As analysts, what do you guys think the odds of this bill passing or not passing is? So I'm going to include in that not just the bill, but the constitutional amendment that's sort of also going through along with the bill. Gabriel, what are your thoughts?
It seems likely that the bill will pass. It seems likely that the amendment will pass, short of a major turnaround in the rallying forces against it, just based on the numbers of representatives in Parliament. And I want to tap into something that Terence was saying in this regard. So 2 points that I'll try to make very briefly. The first one is that there's a nice example set by Russia. If you ask most Russian people, most of the Russian people that I've asked, and statistical polling seems to back this up, why is Putin so popular? He's an extraordinarily popular president, arguably one of the most popular in the world in any democratic country. One of the first answers that you get is that we have a very corrupt government, and with him in charge, at least he's trying to hold them back from taking even more from us. And if you were to remove him, you couldn't reasonably expect to replace him with anyone but something worse. Now, I think this is a logic that South Africans understand very well. In fact, Ramaphosa's greatest mbongis or champions have made this argument. He might not be great, he might not be perfect, but he's a damn sight better than the next person that you're likely to get. Now, this is an important thing to bear in mind, because the expropriation bill and the amendment to the Constitution are not just sunset clauses things for the next couple of years. They are legislation that will come in place in perpetuity, which means they will outlast the presidency of Ramaphosa. And this will also be a fact saliently visible to everyone in the party. And those who want to replace him with someone more radical will make such arguments. And it will mean that whoever is vying within the ANC to become the next president will also be vying to be the person who is now basically in charge of how likely you are to keep or lose your assets. And it is in that kind of condition where power is the most discretionary that it also becomes the most absolute. That is to say, it vests the most tightly in one embodied human being. And that can make someone even more popular, even if they make very bad decisions that impact the nation very badly. Now, the second point that I want to make, and this is where I believe that so many people are being short-sighted and saying, you know, well, we think Ramaphosa is a good guy. As long as he's around, it won't be implemented to the worst. The second point is about race, and I'm going to venture into this since we are, after all, the Institute of Race Relations, is because Terence has spoken very eloquently about the ideology in the ANC. I think there's another kind of ideological point to consider, which comes from, and I'm venturing out onto a branch. Maybe you can cut me off, but Rian Malan wrote arguably the most read sort of non-fiction work in the dying days of apartheid about the state of the nation at the time, My Traitor's Heart. And the metaphor that he kept coming back to was that so many white South Africans thought like this. They thought this has been a heinous and racist country, and to embody it in one person, it is as if one white man has had his boot on the face of one black man, a sort of Orwellian echo to be seen there, and now is thinking about lifting that boot up. And as he does so, he considers the possibility that the black man is going to get up and slash his throat. Revenge for decades of heinous oppression. And he thought this is the real anxiety. And this is the real argument that needs to be made if you want a democratic and peaceful transition, is that this is not going to happen. And that is the sort of argument that was ultimately manifest by the Constitution. That there are these rules and that they're going to hold us all together. And this is very much what our polling shows is what most black people want, what most Indian people want, what most colored people want, and what most white people want, is to live under a state of law with meritocratic rules so that we can all go forward together. That the Constitution is an expression of the popular will in that regard. But I do think it's worth considering another side of the ideological coin, which is a kind of white guilt, which thinks, well, really what should happen is to put a knife in the hand of a race nationalist leader or leadership and say, there are no more rules, and it will be by your good grace that we survive or do not survive. In the same way that it was, unfortunately, the case that it was by, in a sense, the good grace of white South Africans who voted in the referendum to end apartheid. It wasn't a truly democratic exercise. Black people couldn't vote in that. It was a kind of graceful act, an act of mercy, one that one might feel ashamed of. That similarly, there needs to be an act of mercy to really complete the equation. And that in allowing the expropriation bill to go through under St. Cyril, we're saying, here's the knife, but we trust that even if you have it and there's no rules to stop you from using it, you won't use it because you feel, as F.W. de Klerk felt, that even if you're not being forced to do the right thing, you will do the right thing anyway. Now, this is a strange metaphor to apply, but it is something that I see, that I read between the lines in a lot of the sort of political mufflings coming out of corporate South Africa, that, you know, let's not rely on rules to protect us. We can let the rules be a bit crazy. Let's rely on the good grace of St. Cyril and of the ANC to protect us, because in so doing, we will balance the scales in cosmic history, and white nationalism and black nationalism will both have proven themselves to be graceful and merciful, in the same way that Putin proves himself to be graceful and merciful every time he bestows on a citizen the right to see another sunrise, as it were. And I worry about this way of thinking, because I think it puts race in place of power and the corrupting power of power itself. And it misreads the nature of the human condition. It is the nature of the human condition that concentrating and centralizing power does not produce grace.
Indeed, I believe it was I can't remember what clever influential person said it, but it was that if men were indeed saints, then we wouldn't need to even consider laws at all in the first place. And
it's one of the founding fathers of America. Yeah,
indeed. And unfortunately, as many people may wish it, many people may perhaps think it in a part of their heart, we are not ruled by saints. So, and in fact, I can't think of a single country that is. And so getting rid of the rules doesn't seem like a good idea. I saw someone who doesn't seem to agree with the rules-based approach to the universe suggested that we send us and our bonds back to Prussia. I'm not sure why he wants us to go to what is today Poland and Russia, but whatever. Terence, concluding thoughts, and then we'll close it up for today.
You can't send a bond anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it going to be a certificate? Whatever. Anyway.
Look, this is a time of profound peril for South Africa. But you know, it's often been said that in this country the best and the worst never happens, because I think at some level there is a well of good sense, which is sadly not always manifested in our political class, but amongst ordinary people. It's important, as Gabriel said at the beginning, to acknowledge the link between the need for realistic land reform, better executed land reform, but land reform that encourages and supports property rights, as opposed to trying to rip them up, and the illusion that somehow they stand in the way of that aspiration. As Churchill said, keep buggering on. Facing an uncertain future is a tough and daunting thing. But I think one of the wonderful things about working for the Institute is that we have a nearly 100-year tradition of doing that. And South Africa has the future that its people are willing to script for it.
Very well said,
Amen.
Terence. And I see that there are some detractors in the comments who are questioning some of the more basic principles here, like why are property rights important, or how they're not just a relic of, I don't know, an oppressive system or something like that. So I think that's actually, maybe we should do a chat in the future on some very basic principles of why we believe what we believe about the way property relations should work in a free society. But that's way too big a topic to tackle now, and I think we are out of time. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Thank you, gentlemen, for your insight, thoughts, and analysis. And we will catch you all soon. I'm sure we will have another live stream in the near future. And yeah, I can't wait to see you guys all there. Cheers, everyone.